Sarah stood in the marble foyer of what used to be her home, and her hands trembled as she stared at the man she had loved for 7 years. David's jaw was set, his eyes cold and distant, like he was looking at a stranger instead of his pregnant wife. He adjusted his Rolex, the same watch she had bought him when the money first came through, and his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You have 2 options," David said, his voice calm and measured, like he was negotiating a business deal instead of destroying his marriage. "You can leave right now with nothing, or you can stay and work for your keep. The gatekeeper position just opened up, and I think you'd be perfect for the job." Sarah felt the room tilt, and she pressed her hand against her growing belly, feeling the flutter of life inside her, and she couldn't find the words to respond. This was the same man who had sobbed in her arms 5 years ago, begging her to save him, promising he would love her forever. Now he stood before her in a $3,000 suit, offering her a minimum wage job in her own home. But this is not where it all started, and before we continue with the full story, I want you to do something to help us. Like and share this story with your friends and family, and also drop the city and country flag of where you're watching from. We love to know how far this story is traveling. Your support means everything to this family. Now let me take you back to where it all began, 5 years before this moment, because Sarah's nightmare didn't start in that marble foyer. It started with an act of love so pure that it would eventually become the weapon of her own destruction. 5 years ago, Sarah walked into the cramped 1-bedroom apartment she shared with David in a modest neighborhood in Lagos. The place was small, with peeling paint on the walls and a ceiling fan that squeaked every time it rotated, but it had been home. She had just finished her shift at the restaurant where she worked as a waitress, and her feet ached from standing for 8 hours straight. She expected to find David at his laptop, typing away at his business plan like he did every night, fueled by dreams and instant noodles. Instead, she found him on the floor, surrounded by a mountain of bills and final notices. His face was buried in his hands, and his shoulders shook with sobs that came from somewhere deep and desperate. "David," Sarah dropped her bag and rushed to his side, kneeling on the worn carpet. "Baby, what happened?" He looked up at her and his eyes were red and swollen. "It's over," he whispered, and his voice cracked. "The investors pulled out. The bank rejected my loan appeal. I owe money to people who don't wait for payment plans, Sarah. I'm finished." Sarah's heart clenched. She had watched David pour everything into his tech startup for 2 years, sacrificing sleep and meals and any semblance of a normal life. He believed in his vision with a passion that was almost frightening, and she had believed in him because of that passion. "How much do you need?" she asked, even though she knew her waitress salary couldn't make a dent in the kind of debt that made a man cry like this. David laughed, but it was bitter and hollow. $200,000 just to stay afloat. $500,000 to actually have a fighting chance. It might as well be $5 million. "I don't have it, I'll never have it." He looked at her, and something in his expression made her blood run cold. "Maybe everyone would be better off if I just disappeared." "Don't you dare say that," Sarah said, and she grabbed his face between her hands. "Don't you dare give up." "I don't have a choice," David said, and tears streamed down his cheeks. "I've failed at everything. I'm 24 years old and I'm drowning and I don't know how to swim anymore." Sarah pulled him into her arms and held him while he cried. Her mind raced, searching for solutions that didn't exist, trying to find a way to save the man she loved from the darkness that was swallowing him whole. And then she remembered the lottery ticket in her purse, the one she had bought on impulse 3 days ago when she stopped for groceries. She hadn't checked the numbers yet. She usually waited until the weekend, making a little ritual out of it with her morning coffee. But something made her pull away from David, reach for her bag, and take out the crumpled ticket. "Stay here," she said softly. "Just give me 1 minute." She walked to the tiny kitchen and pulled up the lottery website on her phone. Her hands shook as she typed in the numbers one by one, and with each match her heart beat faster. First number match, second number match, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, all of them, every single one. Sarah stared at the screen, at the amount that made her vision blur. $50 million. $50 million that had just landed in her lap like a gift from God or fate or whatever force controlled the universe. She walked back to the living room where David still sat on the floor, and she knelt beside him again. "What if I told you," she said slowly, "that I have a way to save everything?" David looked at her with confusion and hope and disbelief all mixed together. "What do you mean?" Sarah showed him her phone, the lottery website with the winning numbers and the jackpot amount displayed in bright, impossible digits. "I won," she whispered. "David, I won the lottery." He stared at the screen for a long moment, and then he started laughing. Not the bitter laugh from before, but something wild and unbelieving, like a man who had just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff. "You're joking." "This is a joke." "It's not a joke," Sarah said, and she was crying now too, but these were different tears. "It's real, $50 million. Enough to save your company, enough to make your dreams come true." David grabbed her and pulled her close, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Sarah, oh my God, Sarah, we're rich, we can do anything. We can buy a house, travel the world, you can quit that terrible job. We're set for life." But Sarah pulled back and looked him in the eyes. "I don't want a mansion or fancy cars," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "I want you to take this money and build your empire, invest it all, make your company everything you dreamed it could be." David's expression changed, confusion replacing the joy. "All of it, Sarah, that's insane. This is your money." "It's our money," Sarah corrected him. "And I'm investing it in you because I believe in you. You're going to change the world with your ideas, and I want to be the one who made it possible. I don't need credit or recognition. I just need you to succeed." David was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him processing, calculating, dreaming. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "This is life-changing money." "I'm sure," Sarah said, and she kissed him. "Build your dream, David. Show the world what you're capable of." 3 days later, Sarah sat in her father's law office while he drew up the papers. Her father, Marcus, was a retired lawyer who had never fully trusted David's charm and big promises. He looked at his daughter with concern, creasing his weathered face. "Sarah, I don't like this," Marcus said, tapping his pen against the legal pad in front of him. "You're giving away $50 million to a man who couldn't keep his own business afloat. At least let me protect you." "Dad, I love him," Sarah said. "He's going to be my husband, we're a team." Marcus sighed, but he drafted the agreement anyway. Equity Investment Agreement, he titled it. The terms were clear. Sarah was investing $50 million into David Mitchell Enterprises in exchange for equity ownership. In the event of divorce proceedings initiated by the invested party, or in the case of proven infidelity, the capital investor retained 90% ownership of all assets purchased with the initial investment sum. "Make him read this," Marcus said, sliding the papers across the desk. "Every word, and make sure he understands what he's signing." But when David came to the office, he barely glanced at the papers. He was too excited, too desperate, too focused on the lifeline that was finally within reach. "Where do I sign?" he asked, pen already in hand. "David, you should read it first," Sarah said gently. "I trust you," David said, and he signed his name with a flourish. "You're saving my life, Sarah. I'll never forget this. I promise you I'm going to make you so proud." Marcus witnessed the signature with a tight expression, and he gave Sarah a look that said he hoped she knew what she was doing. The next day, Sarah transferred $50 million from her lottery winnings account to David Mitchell Enterprises. She watched the numbers disappear from her balance and appear in his. And she felt nothing but peace. Within 6 months, David's company exploded. The cash injection allowed him to hire the best developers, launch his app, and market it to exactly the right demographic. Within a year, he had made back the initial investment and doubled it. Within 2 years, he was being featured in business magazines as the next big tech genius. And somewhere along the way, David started to forget. Not consciously at first, but little by little, the memory of that night on the floor began to fade. He started telling the story differently at networking events, leaving out the part about Sarah and the lottery ticket. He focused instead on his pivot strategy, his market research, his relentless work ethic. Sarah didn't mind at first. She was proud of him and she didn't need the spotlight. She was content to be his wife, to support him from the background, to celebrate his victories as their victories. But David's amnesia grew stronger as his bank account grew larger. He moved them from the apartment to a townhouse, then from the townhouse to a mansion in one of Lagos's most exclusive neighborhoods. He traded his old sedan for a Bentley, his casual clothes for designer suits. And with each upgrade, he looked at Sarah a little differently. She was still wearing clothes from their apartment days, still content with simple things, still the same humble woman who had handed him her lottery winnings without a second thought. And to David, who was now rubbing shoulders with billionaires and socialites, Sarah started to look like a remnant of his past that no longer fit his present. The final crack in their marriage came when Sarah told him she was pregnant. She had been nervous but excited, imagining his joy, picturing them as parents. Instead, David had gone quiet and then said, "Is this really the right time? I'm about to take the company public." "The right time," Sarah had repeated, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "David, we've been married for 5 years. When would be the right time?" That's when everything changed. David started staying late at the office, coming home with perfume on his collar that wasn't Sarah's scent. He started talking about the business as his business, the house as his house, the money as his money. And then he brought Jessica home. Jessica was everything David's new world valued. Tall, glamorous, with a modeling contract and an Instagram following in the millions. She looked at Sarah like she was the help, and David didn't correct her. The day David served Sarah with divorce papers, she thought it was a nightmare she would wake up from. But it was real. The papers claimed that according to the prenuptial agreement, which had been signed after the money transfer, Sarah was entitled to nothing because all assets belonged solely to David as the founder and CEO of David Mitchell Enterprises. "You're kicking me out?" Sarah had asked, standing in that same marble foyer where our story began. "I'm being generous," David had replied. "I could have you removed by security, but I'm giving you options because despite everything I'm not heartless." And that's when he made the offer that would change everything. Work as the gatekeeper or leave with nothing. Sarah, pregnant and alone and financially dependent, had no choice. She took the uniform and moved into the room above the garage, and she became invisible in the home she had built with her own lottery winnings. But what David didn't know, what he had forgotten in his arrogance and amnesia, was that Sarah still had the receipts. She had the bank transfer. She had the equity agreement he had signed without reading. She had proof that every brick in his empire was built on her $50 million. And as she sat in the guard booth on her first day as a gatekeeper, watching David's Bentley roll through the gate he had forced her to open, Sarah made a decision. She would wait. She would watch. She would let him dig his own grave with his lies and his arrogance. And when the time was right, when he was at the very peak of his success, she would remind him where it all came from. The morning sun beat down on the guard booth like a punishment, and Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. 3 weeks had passed since she had started working as a gatekeeper in her own home, and each day felt like a lifetime. The uniform clung to her skin, too thick for Lagos heat, and her feet were swollen from standing for hours at a time. The baby moved inside her, small flutters that reminded her why she was enduring this nightmare. She couldn't leave, she had nowhere to go and no money to get there. David had made sure of that. At 8:30, a convoy of black SUVs approached the gate. Sarah recognized them immediately as David's business associates, the investors he was courting for the upcoming IPO. Her hands moved automatically to press the button, and the heavy iron gates swung open with a mechanical groan that echoed through the morning air. The first car slowed as it passed the booth, and a man in the passenger seat glanced at her with casual indifference. "Miss, there's a water bottle on the ground by the entrance. Clean it up." Sarah nodded, keeping her eyes down like she had learned to do. "Yes, sir." She waited until the convoy passed, then walked to the entrance and picked up the discarded bottle. It was still half full, and she wondered which one of them had thrown it there, treating her driveway like a garbage dump. She carried it back to the booth and dropped it in the small trash bin, and something inside her chest tightened with rage that she couldn't afford to release. By noon, the heat was unbearable. Sarah's water bottle was empty, and the small fan in the booth had stopped working sometime during the morning. She felt dizzy, and when she stood up to stretch her legs, the world tilted sideways. She grabbed the edge of the desk and held on until the sensation passed, taking deep breaths and telling herself she could survive this. At 1 o'clock, a cherry-red Ferrari pulled up to the gate, and Sarah's stomach dropped when she saw who was behind the wheel. Jessica. The woman was wearing oversized sunglasses and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. She rolled down the window and looked at Sarah like she was examining an insect. "Well, well," Jessica said, her voice dripping with amusement. "The gatekeeper. David told me about you, but I didn't believe it until I saw it with my own eyes." Sarah pressed the button to open the gate, keeping her expression neutral. "Welcome, ma'am." Jessica laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the afternoon heat. "Ma'am, oh, that's precious. You know what David told me about you. He said you used to wait tables when he met you. He said you were so desperate to marry rich that you latched onto him when he was nobody, hoping he'd make something of himself one day." The lies burned in Sarah's ears, each word a carefully constructed revision of history. She wanted to tell Jessica the truth, to scream that every diamond on her wrist had been bought with Sarah's lottery money, that the car she was driving had been purchased with Sarah's investment. But she didn't. She stood there in her oversized uniform, pregnant and powerless, and let the woman speak. "It suits you honestly," Jessica continued, examining her manicured nails. "Opening gates, taking orders. David built this empire from nothing, pure genius and hard work, and now you get to watch him succeed from behind a glass window. It's almost poetic." Sarah's jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "Will that be all, ma'am?" Jessica's smile widened. "Actually, no. David and I are having a dinner party tonight. Very exclusive, very important people. Make sure you're extra alert when they arrive. Some of these guests are worth more than you'll make in 10 lifetimes. She paused, tilting her head. Oh, and David mentioned you're pregnant. Congratulations, I guess, though I can't imagine raising a child in a guard booth. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to be so useless. The Ferrari roared through the gate, leaving Sarah standing in a cloud of exhaust fumes and humiliation. She walked back into the booth and sat down heavily, pressing her hands against her belly where the baby was moving. I'm sorry, she whispered to the life inside her. I'm so sorry you have to be part of this. But then she thought about the documents hidden in her room, the proof of everything David had stolen and rewritten. She thought about the equity agreement with her father's careful handwriting, the bank transfer that showed the truth in black and white. And she reminded herself that this wasn't forever. This was temporary suffering for permanent victory. Hey fam, if you're feeling the emotion of this story, I need you to show some love right now. Drop a like on this video because Sarah's journey is getting more intense, and you need to see where this goes. Comment below with your city and country flag. Let's see how many countries are riding with Sarah. And don't forget to subscribe because this family is growing and every single one of you matters. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Now let's get back to Sarah, because the dinner party that night was about to push her to her absolute breaking point. At 6 in the evening, cars started arriving. Luxury vehicles one after another, each one more expensive than the last. Mercedes, Range Rovers, a Rolls-Royce that probably cost more than most houses. Sarah opened the gate for each one, greeting them with the same practiced politeness, watching as they drove up to the mansion that she had paid for with her lottery winnings. Through the booth window, she could see the mansion lit up like a palace. Chandeliers glowed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she could make out the shapes of people moving inside, laughing and drinking champagne that probably cost more per bottle than her weekly gatekeeper salary. At 7:30, David's Bentley approached. He wasn't alone. Jessica sat in the passenger seat, and Sarah could see them talking and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Sarah pressed the button, and the gate opened. But this time, the car stopped directly in front of the booth. David rolled down his window, and the sound of music and laughter spilled out into the evening air. He was wearing a tuxedo, custom-made and perfectly tailored, and Jessica's dress sparkled with what looked like real diamonds. Sarah, David said, and his tone was the one he used with servants. We're expecting about 20 more guests. Stay alert. Some of these people are very important to my business and I can't have them waiting at the gate. Yes, sir, Sarah said, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Jessica leaned across David to look at Sarah through the window. Oh, and honey, you might want to fix your hair. You look exhausted. It's not a good look for David's estate. David didn't correct her. He didn't defend Sarah or tell Jessica to be kind. He just nodded like Jessica had made a reasonable observation, then rolled up the window and drove through the gate without another word. Sarah stood there for a long moment after they were gone, staring at the mansion where she used to live, where she used to wake up next to David and believe that they were building a life together. The life growing inside her kicked, and she placed her hand over the spot, feeling the small movements that reminded her she wasn't completely alone. More cars arrived, more wealthy people who looked through Sarah like she was part of the furniture. She opened the gate, closed the gate, opened it again. Over and over, a mechanical routine that numbed her mind and made the hours pass like thick molasses. At 9 o'clock, a man in a silver Jaguar stopped at the booth. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Good evening, he said, and unlike the others, he actually looked at her like she was a person. Good evening, sir, Sarah replied, reaching for the gate button. Hot night to be working, the man said. You doing okay out here? The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly broke her. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back and forced a smile. I'm fine, thank you. The man studied her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted. You're David's wife, aren't you, Sarah? Sarah's heart stopped. She didn't know who this man was or how he knew her, and panic flooded through her veins. I'm the gatekeeper, sir. I'm Richard Chen, the man said gently. I'm one of the primary investors in David's company. I met you 2 years ago at a charity gala. You were wearing a blue dress, and you told me about the education program you were trying to start for underprivileged children. Sarah remembered. That was before everything fell apart, back when David still let her attend events, before he started being ashamed of her humble nature and simple tastes. I remember, she said quietly. Richard's expression hardened with something that looked like anger, but it wasn't directed at her. What happened? Why are you working the gate? It's complicated, Sarah said, and she could hear her voice shaking. I should let you through, sir. The party is waiting. Richard didn't move. Does David know you're pregnant? He knows, Sarah whispered. The older man's jaw tightened, and he looked toward the mansion with disgust. That boy has forgotten where he came from. I've seen it happen before, young men who get a taste of success and lose their humanity in the process. But this, he shook his head, this is beyond cruel. Sarah didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to defend David, to explain that he wasn't always like this, that he used to be kind and grateful and loving. But that man was gone, and she couldn't pretend otherwise. Do you need help? Richard asked. I have connections, I can make some calls. No, Sarah said quickly, because she couldn't risk anyone interfering with her plan. Thank you, but I'm handling it. Richard looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him processing, trying to understand. Finally, he nodded slowly. If you change your mind, you let me know. David might have forgotten his values, but some of us haven't. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, handing it through the window. Call me if you need anything, and I mean anything. Sarah took the card with trembling fingers. Thank you. Richard drove through the gate, and Sarah watched him go with a strange mixture of gratitude and pain. It had been so long since someone had treated her like she mattered, and the kindness cut deeper than any insult because it reminded her of what she had lost. At midnight, the party was still going strong. Sarah could hear music and laughter echoing across the grounds, and through the booth window she could see people dancing in the ballroom. David was in the center of it all, his arm around Jessica's waist, playing the role of successful businessman and perfect host. Sarah felt the baby kick again, harder this time, and a sharp pain shot through her lower back. She had been on her feet for 18 hours, and exhaustion was dragging her down like quicksand. She sat in the chair and closed her eyes, just for a moment, just to rest. She woke up to the sound of honking. Disoriented, Sarah jerked upright and saw headlights glaring through the booth window. Someone was trying to leave, and the gate was still closed. She fumbled for the button, her hands clumsy with sleep, and pressed it. The gate opened, and an angry driver yelled something she couldn't quite hear before speeding through. Panic seized her. If David found out she had fallen asleep, if he knew she had made a guest wait, he would use it as an excuse to fire her. And if he fired her, she would have nothing. No shelter, no food, no way to protect her unborn child. She stood up too quickly and the world spun. The pain in her back intensified, spreading around to her stomach in a way that made her breath catch. She grabbed the edge of the desk and waited for it to pass, but it didn't. Instead, it got worse. Something was wrong. Sarah felt wetness between her legs, and when she looked down, her heart dropped. Blood, not a lot, but enough to terrify her. She pressed her hand against her belly and felt the baby moving, still alive, still fighting. Please, she whispered to whoever might be listening. Please don't let anything happen to my baby. She reached for her phone with shaking hands and dialed the only number she knew might care. Her mother. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and Sarah was about to hang up when her mother's sleepy voice answered. Sarah, baby, it's midnight, what's wrong? Mama, Sarah said, and her voice broke. Something's wrong with the baby, I need help. Her mother's voice sharpened with fear. Where are you? I'm coming right now. I'm at the gate, Sarah said. David's estate, I'm the gatekeeper. Mama, please hurry. She heard her mother moving, grabbing keys, and then the line went dead. Sarah sat back down in the chair and pressed both hands against her belly, feeling the baby's movements growing weaker. Tears streamed down her face, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she let herself sob. Up at the mansion, the party continued. Music played. People laughed. David celebrated his success with the woman who had replaced her. And down at the gate, in a booth that smelled like dust and defeat, Sarah sat alone in the dark and prayed that her baby would survive the cruelty of the man she had once loved. Because if something happened to this child, if David's heartlessness cost her the one pure thing left in her life, she didn't know if she could hold back her rage long enough to execute her plan. She didn't know if she would want to. Sarah's mother arrived 30 minutes later in her old Toyota, tires screeching as she pulled up to the gate. Margaret Williams was a small woman with steel in her spine, and when she saw her daughter doubled over in the guard booth, pale and trembling, something fierce and protective blazed in her eyes. My baby, Margaret whispered, rushing to Sarah's side. She wrapped her arms around her daughter and felt how thin she had become, how the uniform hung off her frame like she was disappearing inside it. What has he done to you? Sarah couldn't answer. Another wave of pain rolled through her abdomen, stealing her breath and making her grip her mother's arm with desperate strength. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped, and every minute felt like an eternity of terror that she might lose the child growing inside her. We need to get you to a hospital, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear Sarah could see in her eyes. Right now. I can't leave the gate, Sarah gasped. If David finds out I abandon my post, he'll throw me out. Mama, I have nowhere else to go. Margaret's face hardened with an anger Sarah had only seen a few times in her life. Then David can go straight to hell. You're bleeding, Sarah. Your baby is in danger. Nothing else matters. She helped Sarah to her feet and guided her toward the car, and Sarah didn't have the strength left to protest. As they passed through the gate that Sarah was supposed to be watching, she looked back at the mansion one last time. The lights still blazed. The music still played. David's party continued without pause, and he had no idea that the mother of his child was fighting for their baby's life less than 100 meters from where he was dancing. The drive to the hospital was a blur of pain and fear. Margaret drove like she was racing death itself, one hand on the wheel and the other holding Sarah's hand, while her daughter cried silently in the passenger seat. They arrived at the emergency entrance of Lagos General Hospital, and nurses rushed out with a wheelchair when they saw Sarah's condition. "How far along are you?" a nurse asked as they wheeled her through the automatic doors. 5 months, Sarah managed to say through clenched teeth. "Please, is my baby okay?" The nurse's expression remained professionally neutral, but Sarah saw the concern in her eyes. "We're going to take care of you both, just try to stay calm." They rushed her into an examination room, and a doctor arrived within minutes. Dr. Adebio was a woman in her 40s with gentle hands and a no-nonsense demeanor that Sarah found oddly comforting. She examined Sarah while Margaret stood in the corner, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Your blood pressure is dangerously high," Dr. Adebio said, her voice calm but serious. "And you're showing signs of severe stress and malnutrition. How long have you been experiencing these symptoms?" Sarah thought about the past 3 weeks of standing in the heat, skipping meals, because she couldn't afford to buy food on her Gatekeeper salary, pushing her body beyond its limits because she had no other choice. "A while," she whispered. Dr. Adebio's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to be honest with me. Are you in a safe situation at home?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah felt her mother's eyes on her. She wanted to lie to protect David somehow, to pretend that everything was fine. But she was so tired of lying, so exhausted from carrying the weight of his cruelty alone. "No," Sarah said, and the word came out like a confession. "I'm not safe, but I have nowhere else to go." The doctor exchanged a look with one of the nurses, and Sarah saw them communicating silently the way medical professionals do when they recognize abuse. "We're going to keep you overnight for observation," Dr. Adebio said. "The baby's heartbeat is strong, but you need rest and proper nutrition. If you don't take care of yourself, you could lose this pregnancy." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Lose the pregnancy. Lose the baby. Lose the only thing that still connected her to the man David used to be, before the money changed him into someone she didn't recognize. "I'll do whatever you need me to do," Sarah said. "Just please save my baby." They admitted her to a small private room, and Margaret sat in the chair beside the bed, holding her daughter's hand while Sarah drifted in and out of an exhausted sleep. At 3 in the morning, Sarah's phone rang. She jerked awake and saw David's name on the screen, and her heart began to race. "Answer it," Margaret said quietly. "Let's hear what he has to say." Sarah pressed the answer button with shaking fingers and held the phone to her ear. "Hello. Where the hell are you?" David's voice was cold and furious, and she could hear music still playing in the background. "The gate is wide open. Anyone could walk in. Do you have any idea how irresponsible this is?" Sarah closed her eyes and felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Not once did he ask if she was okay. Not once did he show concern for her or the baby. His only worry was his precious gate, his security, his property. "I'm in the hospital," Sarah said quietly. "There was bleeding, the baby." "So you just abandoned your post?" David interrupted, and his voice rose with indignation. "Without calling anyone, without making arrangements. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of behavior that proves you can't handle responsibility." Margaret snatched the phone from Sarah's hand, and her voice cracked like a whip. "This is Margaret. Your wife is in the hospital because she's been working 18-hour days while pregnant, standing in the heat with no breaks and barely any food. She's here because your cruelty nearly killed your child, and you're worried about a gate." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Sarah could picture David's face, the way he looked when someone challenged him in front of others. "Mrs. Williams, this is a private matter between my wife and me." "Your wife," Margaret's laugh was bitter. "You've turned her into a servant. You've humiliated her, isolated her, and pushed her body to the breaking point. My husband warned Sarah about you 5 years ago, and God rest his soul, he was right. Hey, my people, I need you to pause with me for just a moment because this story is hitting different, isn't it? If Sarah's struggle is touching your heart, drop that like button right now. Comment below with your city and country flag, and tell me what you would do in Sarah's position. And please, subscribe to this family because we're building something special here, and I need you all with me for what's coming next. Now let's get back to Margaret, because she wasn't finished with David yet. You know what the worst part is? Margaret continued, her voice shaking with rage. Sarah gave you everything, David, and you repaid her by treating her like garbage. But what goes around comes around, and I promise you, your day of reckoning is coming. She ended the call and handed the phone back to Sarah, who was crying silently into her pillow. Margaret sat back down and stroked her daughter's hair like she used to do when Sarah was a child having nightmares. I can't go back there, Sarah whispered. Mama, I can't do it anymore. Then don't, Margaret said firmly. You come home with me, we'll figure it out together. Your apartment is too small. There's barely room for you, let alone me and a baby. Then we'll make room, Margaret insisted. We'll put a crib in the living room. We'll make it work because that's what family does. You don't have to suffer for a man who doesn't love you, Sarah. You don't have to destroy yourself trying to prove your worth to someone who refuses to see it. Sarah wanted to agree. She wanted to leave with her mother and never look back, to forget about David and the mansion and the empire she had built with her lottery winnings. But something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the memory of her father's face when he had drawn up that equity agreement, the way he had looked at her and said, "This is insurance, baby girl, just in case." Her father had known. Somehow, he had seen into the future and anticipated this exact moment, and he had given her the weapon she needed to fight back. I need 2 more weeks, Sarah said, and her voice was stronger now, filled with a determination that cut through the exhaustion and pain. Just 2 more weeks, and then I'll never have to see David again. Margaret studied her daughter's face, seeing something there that made her pause. What are you planning? Justice, Sarah said simply. Daddy made sure I had options and I'm going to use them, but I need to wait for the right moment. David is taking the company public in 2 weeks. He's planning to marry Jessica the day before the IPO launches. The investors will be there, the press will be there, everyone who matters in his world will be watching. Understanding dawned on Margaret's face, followed by something that looked almost like satisfaction. The equity agreement. He has no idea I still have it, Sarah said. He thinks he can erase me from his story and rewrite history to make himself the hero. But I have proof of everything, Mama. The lottery ticket, the bank transfer, the legal documents. I have evidence that every single thing he owns was built on my money. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see her mother wrestling with something. Finally, she spoke. Your father would be proud of you, but Sarah, are you sure? Once you do this, there's no going back. David will never forgive you. Good, Sarah said, and there was steel in her voice that surprised even her. I don't want his forgiveness. I want him to feel exactly what he's made me feel. Powerless, humiliated, erased. I want him to understand what it's like to lose everything in a single moment. The next morning, Dr. Adebayo came to check on Sarah. The bleeding had stopped and the baby's heartbeat remained strong, but the doctor's expression was grave. You can go home today, she said. But Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to hear me clearly. If you continue living under this level of stress, your body will shut down. The human body can only take so much before it breaks, and you're dangerously close to that point. For the sake of your baby, you need to make a change. I will, Sarah promised. Just 2 more weeks and everything changes. Margaret drove Sarah back to the estate that afternoon, and they sat in the car outside the gate for a long moment, neither of them speaking. The mansion looked the same as always, beautiful and cold, and completely indifferent to the suffering it had witnessed. Are you sure about this? Margaret asked one more time. Sarah nodded, her hand resting on her belly where the baby was moving, strong and alive despite everything. I'm sure. But Mama, I need you to do something for me. I need you to keep the documents safe. The equity agreement, the bank transfer receipt, all of it. If something happens to me before the IPO, I need you to make sure the truth comes out. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Nothing is going to happen to you, but yes, I'll keep them safe. They transferred the documents from Sarah's bag to Margaret's purse, and Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The evidence was secure now, protected by the one person in the world she could trust completely. 2 weeks, Sarah said, opening the car door. I can survive anything for 2 weeks. She walked back to the guard booth, and it felt different now. Not like a prison, but like a temporary station on her way to something better. She had a plan. She had proof. She had her father's foresight and her mother's strength, and she had endured too much to give up now. David's Bentley appeared at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and Sarah opened the gate with steady hands. The car slowed, and David rolled down the window. His face was tight with anger, but there was something else there too, something that might have been guilt if Sarah didn't know better. Are you back to work? He asked, his voice clipped. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, keeping her tone neutral and professional. The doctor said you're fine. The baby and I are both fine, Sarah corrected, emphasizing the word baby because she wanted him to remember what he had almost lost through his negligence and cruelty. David's jaw clenched. Good, then we don't need to discuss yesterday's incident again. But Sarah, if you ever abandon your post like that without notifying me first, you're finished here. Understood. Sarah looked at him through the car window. This man she had loved enough to give up $50 million. This man who had cried in her arms and promised her the world. He was a stranger now, and that realization brought not sadness but clarity. Understood, she said. Will that be all, sir? David stared at her for a moment, and Sarah could see him trying to figure out why she seemed different. Why the defeated woman he had left bleeding in a guard booth was now standing before him with something unreadable in her eyes. But he couldn't figure it out because he had never really known her at all. That's all, he said finally, and drove through the gate. Sarah watched him go, and for the first time in months she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just remembered her own power, who had counted her weapons and found them more than sufficient for the battle ahead. David thought he had won. He thought Sarah was broken, defeated, and too weak to fight back. He thought his lies about being self-made were so well established that no one would question them. He thought the IPO would cement his legacy as a genius businessman who had built an empire from nothing. He had no idea that his wife, the gatekeeper he dismissed and humiliated every single day, was about to destroy everything he had stolen from her. The countdown had begun. 14 days until the IPO. 14 days until David's wedding to Jessica. 14 days until Sarah stood in front of his investors and the press and revealed the truth that would bring his entire world crashing down. She could wait 14 days. After everything she had endured, 14 days was nothing. But David should have been counting too, because his time was running out, and he didn't even know it. 10 days before the IPO, the estate transformed into a circus of preparation. Wedding planners rushed in and out with fabric samples and flower arrangements, while David's executive team held marathon meetings in the conference room about stock valuations and investor presentations. Sarah watched it all from her guard booth, opening the gate for countless strangers who were helping David build the illusion of his perfect life. She had stopped sleeping through the nights, not from anxiety but from anticipation. Every morning when she woke up, she counted down the days like a prisoner marking time on a cell wall. 10 days, 9 days, 8 days. Each one brought her closer to the moment when David's carefully constructed lies would collapse around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. On the 8th day, a massive delivery truck arrived carrying the wedding decorations. Sarah opened the gate and watched as workers unloaded white roses by the thousands, crystal centerpieces that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the driveway, and a wedding arch wrapped in gold silk that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. Jessica arrived an hour later in her Ferrari, and this time she didn't just mock Sarah through the car window. She actually got out of the vehicle and walked up to the guard booth, her heels clicking on the pavement like a countdown to confrontation. "I want to thank you," Jessica said, and her smile was poison wrapped in honey. "Truly, Sarah, if you hadn't been such a disappointment as a wife, David never would have realized he deserved better. So in a way, my happiness is all because of your failure." Sarah kept her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully neutral. She had learned over the past weeks that showing emotion only fed Jessica's cruelty, so she had become a master at hiding everything behind a mask of indifference. "Is there something I can help you with, ma'am?" Sarah asked politely. Jessica's smile faltered slightly, frustrated by Sarah's lack of reaction. "David told me about your little hospital drama, how you abandoned your post and nearly cost him his security. He said you're lucky he's giving you another chance, that most employers would have fired you on the spot." The lies strung, but Sarah had expected them. Of course, David had twisted the story to make himself look generous and her look incompetent. That was who he had become, a man who rewrote reality to suit his narrative. "Mr. Mitchell has been very generous," Sarah said, and the words felt like swallowing glass, but she forced them out because she needed Jessica to underestimate her. She needed everyone to see her as the defeated, broken woman who was no threat to anyone. Jessica studied her for a moment, and Sarah could see her trying to find satisfaction in Sarah's submission. "You know what the best part of the wedding will be," Jessica said, leaning against the booth window. "When David and I say our vows, you'll be right here, opening the gate for our guests. You'll watch everyone celebrate our love while you sit alone in this little box, remembering what you lost." Sarah met Jessica's eyes and saw the cruelty there, the pleasure she took in Sarah's supposed suffering. And for just a moment, Sarah let herself imagine Jessica's face when the truth came out. The shock, the horror, the realization that everything she thought she knew was a lie. "I hope you have a beautiful wedding," Sarah said softly, and she meant it. Because the more perfect David's day seemed, the more devastating the fall would be. Jessica laughed, tossed her hair, and walked back to her car. Sarah watched her drive through the gate, and she allowed herself a small smile. 7 more days. Jessica could laugh all she wanted now, because in 7 days that laughter would turn to ashes. That afternoon, Richard Chen returned. Sarah recognized his silver Jaguar immediately, and when she opened the gate, he stopped and rolled down his window just like he had at the party. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and the genuine concern in his voice was still startling after weeks of David's indifference and Jessica's mockery. "Better, thank you," Sarah replied. "The baby is strong." Richard nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about what I saw that night. Sarah, I want you to know that I've been watching David more carefully since then, and I'm seeing things that concern me." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" "Inconsistencies," Richard said carefully. "In his story about how he built the company, I've known a lot of entrepreneurs over my 40 years in business, and something about David's narrative never quite added up. Nobody goes from bankrupt to billionaire in 5 years without significant capital injection, no matter how brilliant their business model." Sarah's mind raced. Richard was an investor, someone with influence and credibility. If he started asking questions, if he started digging into the company's financial history, he might discover the truth before Sarah was ready to reveal it. She needed to control the timing, to wait until the IPO event when maximum damage could be inflicted. "Mr. Chen," Sarah said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm handling my situation. I just need you to trust me for 1 more week." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, and Sarah could see him putting pieces together. He was a smart man, someone who had built his own fortune through careful observation and strategic thinking. "1 more week," he repeated. "That's when the IPO launches." Sarah didn't confirm or deny, but something in her expression must have communicated enough because Richard's face changed. Understanding dawned, followed by something that looked almost like respect. "The wedding is the day before the IPO," Richard said slowly. "David is combining the 2 events to maximize publicity. Every major investor and media outlet will be there." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "That's when you're going to make your move." Sarah remained silent, but her hands trembled slightly, and Richard saw it. "Good," he said quietly. "Whatever you're planning, David has it coming, but Sarah, be prepared. When you expose someone publicly like that, there's no going back. He'll fight you with everything he has." "Let him fight," Sarah said, and her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I have something he doesn't have. I have the truth." Richard smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had seen many battles in the business world and knew how to recognize a warrior. "If you need a witness or an ally when the time comes, you let me know. I'll be there." He drove through the gate, and Sarah sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. She hadn't planned on having an ally, but Richard's support meant more than he probably realized. Having a respected investor on her side would add credibility to her claims and make it harder for David to dismiss her accusations as the ramblings of a bitter ex-wife. "Hey fam, we're getting close to the moment you've all been waiting for, and I need you to show some love right now. If you're invested in Sarah's journey, if you're counting down these days with her, drop that like button. Comment your city and country flag, and tell me what you think is going to happen when Sarah finally reveals the truth. Subscribe to this storytelling family, because what's coming in the next episode is going to blow your mind. I promise you, everything has been building to this moment. Now let's get back to Sarah, because the final days before the IPO were about to test her resolve in ways she never expected. 5 days before the IPO, David held a press conference at the estate. Journalists from major business publications gathered on the lawn, and Sarah watched from her booth as David stood at a podium, flanked by Jessica on one side and his executive team on the other, telling his story to the world. "I was 24 years old and drowning in debt," David said, his voice carrying across the grounds with practiced sincerity. "I had a dream and a laptop, but no money and no connections. Everyone told me to give up, to get a regular job and forget about entrepreneurship, but I refused to quit. I worked 18-hour days, lived on instant noodles, and poured every ounce of my energy into building something meaningful." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she listened to him erase her from the narrative. No mention of the lottery ticket. No acknowledgement of the $50 million that had saved him. Just pure fiction delivered with such conviction that even Sarah might have believed it if she hadn't lived through the truth. 5 years later, David continued, We're about to take this company public with a valuation of over $2 billion. And I want every young person out there to know that if I can do it, so can you. Success isn't about luck or handouts. It's about grit, determination, and refusing to accept failure. The journalists applauded, and cameras flashed as David smiled his perfect smile. Jessica squeezed his hand, playing the role of supportive partner, and Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. They were building a mythology, creating a legacy based on lies, and the world was eating it up because people loved stories about self-made success. But Sarah knew something they didn't. Myths could be destroyed, lies could be exposed, and in 5 days she would bring the whole illusion crashing down. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her small bed above the garage, feeling the baby kick and move inside her, and she thought about what Richard had said. Once you expose someone publicly like that, there's no going back. Was she ready for that? Was she prepared for the war that would follow? She thought about her father, about the day he had drawn up the equity agreement. He had looked at her with such seriousness and said, "Sarah, I hope you never need this. I hope David proves me wrong and loves you the way you deserve to be loved. But if he doesn't, if he ever tries to take advantage of your kindness, you'll have this insurance." Her father had known. Somehow, he had seen into David's character and anticipated this exact betrayal. And he had given Sarah the tools to fight back, not out of revenge, but out of a father's desperate need to protect his daughter. "I'm ready, Daddy," Sarah whispered into the darkness. "I'm going to make you proud." 3 days before the IPO, the rehearsal dinner took place. Sarah watched luxury cars arrive one after another, carrying David's business associates and Jessica's socialite friends. The lawn was transformed with twinkling lights and elegant table settings, and the air filled with the sound of champagne corks popping and wealthy people laughing. David's Bentley pulled up to the gate at 7 o'clock, and Sarah opened it without being asked. The car stopped, and David got out, walking over to the booth with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "I want to talk to you," he said, and for a moment, he sounded almost like the old David, the one who used to hold her hand and tell her she made him believe in himself. Sarah stepped out of the booth, her pregnant belly now impossible to hide even under the loose uniform. "What is it?" David looked at her stomach and something flickered across his face. Regret, guilt. Sarah couldn't tell, and she realized she didn't care anymore. Whatever he felt was too little, too late. "After the wedding," David said slowly, "after the IPO, I want to set up a trust fund for the baby. Make sure the child is taken care of, has access to good schools and opportunities." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You think money fixes everything? You've spent months treating me like garbage, forcing me to work as a gatekeeper while pregnant, ignoring me while I nearly lost our baby, and now you want to throw money at the problem." "I'm trying to be responsible," David said. And there was defensiveness in his voice. "The child didn't ask to be born into this situation." "No," Sarah agreed quietly. "The child didn't ask for any of this, but you created this situation, David. You chose to betray me, humiliate me, and erase me from your life. And now you think a trust fund makes you a good father." David's jaw tightened. "What do you want from me, Sarah? You want me to apologize? Fine, I'm sorry things turned out this way, but we can't go back. We can only move forward, and I'm trying to do the right thing for our child." Sarah looked at the man who had cried in her arms 5 years ago, the man she had loved enough to sacrifice everything for, and she felt nothing. The love was gone, burned away by months of cruelty and lies. What remained was something colder and sharper, something that knew how to calculate and plan, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. "You're right," Sarah said. "We can't go back, so let's move forward. Enjoy your rehearsal dinner, David. Enjoy your wedding preparations. And when the IPO comes, I hope you get everything you deserve." David studied her face, and Sarah could see confusion in his eyes. He was used to her submission, her quiet acceptance of whatever he threw at her. This new Sarah, the one who met his gaze without flinching, was foreign to him. "Are you okay?" he asked, and for just a second there was genuine concern in his voice. Sarah almost laughed. After everything he had put her through, after forcing her to work as a gatekeeper while pregnant, after bringing his mistress to live in their home, he was asking if she was okay. "I'm fine," Sarah said. "Better than fine, actually. For the first time in months, I know exactly where I stand and what I need to do." David didn't understand, and that was perfect. Let him be confused. Let him wonder what had changed. In 3 days, all his questions would be answered. He walked back to his car without another word, and Sarah returned to her booth. Through the window, she could see the rehearsal dinner in full swing. Beautiful people in beautiful clothes, celebrating a beautiful lie. Jessica was laughing, her hand on David's arm, basking in the attention and admiration. Sarah pulled out her phone and called her mother. "Mama, do you still have the documents?" "Safe and sound," Margaret replied. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," Sarah said, and her voice was iron. "I'm having my first certainties. 3 days, Mama. In 3 days, David's world ends and mine begins again." Margaret was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that made Sarah's eyes burn with tears. "Your father would be so proud of you, baby. Not for revenge, but for remembering your worth. For refusing to disappear just because someone tried to erase you." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the booth and watched the party continue. The sun set over Lagos, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not anger anymore, but something cleaner and more powerful. Purpose. David had taken everything from her. Her home, her dignity, her sense of self. He had rewritten their history to make himself the hero and her the burden. He had reduced her to a gatekeeper in her own mansion, forced her to bow and scrape and pretend she was nothing. But he had made one critical mistake. He had forgotten that Sarah wasn't actually nothing. She was the woman who had won $50 million and chosen love over luxury. She was the woman who had saved him from ruin and asked for nothing in return. She was the woman who had endured months of humiliation while secretly holding the documents that proved everything he owned was built on her sacrifice. David had forgotten who Sarah really was, but in 3 days he was going to remember. And by then it would be far too late. The wedding day arrived with cloudless skies and perfect weather, as if the universe itself was setting the stage for what was about to unfold. Sarah woke up at dawn in her room above the garage, and for the first time in months, she didn't put on the grey gatekeeper uniform. Instead, she opened the small closet and pulled out a dress she had hidden in the back, wrapped in plastic to protect it from dust and time. It was the dress she had worn 5 years ago when she won the lottery. Simple, elegant, blue like the Lagos sky, and it still fit despite her pregnancy because she had lost so much weight over the past months. Sarah looked at herself in the cracked mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face was thinner, harder, but her eyes burned with something that hadn't been there before: determination, purpose, power. She called her mother at 6 in the morning. "It's time, Mama. Bring the documents to the estate. The ceremony starts at 11, but the IPO presentation is at 2. That's when I need you here." Margaret's voice was steady and fierce. "I'll be there, baby. Your father and I were both with you today." Sarah touched the small pendant around her neck, the one her father had given her on her 18th birthday. She hadn't taken it off since he passed away, and today it felt like a talisman, a reminder that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. At 8 o'clock, the estate exploded into controlled chaos. Florists rushed across the lawn with armfuls of white roses, caterers unloaded trays of expensive food, and a string quartet practiced near the wedding arch that gleamed gold in the morning sunlight. Sarah watched from her window as Jessica emerged from the main house in a silk robe, directing staff with the authority of someone who believed she already owned everything. David appeared an hour later in his tuxedo, looking like a man on top of the world. He was smiling, shaking hands with early arriving guests, playing the role of successful entrepreneur and happy groom with practiced ease. Sarah watched him and felt nothing but cold clarity. This was the man who had sobbed in her arms and promised her forever. This was the man she had saved with her lottery winnings. And this was the man who had repaid her kindness with cruelty, so profound, it had nearly cost her their child. At 10:30, Margaret's Toyota pulled up to the gate. Sarah walked down from her room, not as the gatekeeper, but as the rightful owner of everything David thought was his. Her mother got out of the car carrying a leather briefcase, and when their eyes met, no words were needed. "You ready?" Margaret asked quietly. "I've been ready for months," Sarah replied. "I was just waiting for the right moment." They walked together toward the mansion, and Sarah could feel eyes on her as staff members and early guests noticed the pregnant woman in the blue dress moving through the grounds with quiet confidence. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wasn't opening gates or taking orders. She was walking like she owned the place, because legally she did. The wedding ceremony was set up on the south lawn, with 300 white chairs arranged in perfect rows facing the golden arch. Guests were beginning to arrive, wealthy men and women in designer clothes, business leaders and socialites who had come to witness David's triumph and Jessica's victory. Sarah and Margaret didn't go to the ceremony. Instead, they walked to the grand hall where the IPO presentation would take place after the wedding. The room was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lagos, a stage at the front with a podium and a large projection screen, and tables set up for the investors and press who would attend the announcement. Richard Chen was already there, supervising the setup of the presentation materials. When he saw Sarah walk in, his eyes widened, and then understanding flooded his face. "Sarah," he said, walking over to her, Today is the day. Today is the day, Sarah confirmed. Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something. When I reveal what I'm about to reveal, when I show everyone the truth about where David's money came from, will you stand with me? Richard looked at her for a long moment, this pregnant woman in a simple blue dress who had been reduced to a gatekeeper in her own home, and he nodded slowly. I've spent 40 years in business, Sarah, and I've learned to recognize integrity when I see it. Whatever you're about to do, I'll support you. But I need to warn you, David has powerful friends here today. They won't take kindly to being embarrassed. Let them be angry, Sarah said quietly. The truth doesn't stop being true just because it makes people uncomfortable. At 11 o'clock, music began to play on the south lawn. The wedding was starting. Sarah stood by the window and watched as Jessica walked down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than most people's houses, her face radiant with the certainty that she had won everything. David stood at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo, smiling like a man who had conquered the world. The ceremony was beautiful. The vows were perfect. Jessica promised to love David in success and in failure, though Sarah knew she had never seen him in failure and never would have stayed if she had. David promised to cherish Jessica forever, to build a life with her that honored the empire he had created through hard work and determination. Maury lies, beautiful, polished lies spoken in front of 300 witnesses. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause. Champagne corks popped. People cheered. And Sarah stood in the grand hall, one hand on her pregnant belly, watching the celebration of a marriage built on the ruins of her own. Mama, Sarah whispered, do you think I'm doing the right thing? Margaret took her daughter's hand and squeezed it tightly. Baby, you're doing the only thing. That man stole from you, not just money but credit, dignity and respect. He erased you from his story and then forced you to watch while he celebrated his stolen success. You're not seeking revenge, you're demanding justice. At 2 o'clock, guests began filtering from the lawn into the grand hall. The mood was festive, celebratory, full of wealthy people who had enjoyed expensive food and champagne, and were now ready to witness David's company go public and make them all even richer. The investors took their seats at the front tables. The press set up their cameras along the sides, and David and Jessica stood near the stage, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs. Sarah and Margaret stood in the back corner, partially hidden behind a column. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but her hands were steady as she held the briefcase containing the documents that would destroy David's entire world. David stepped up to the podium and the room quieted. He looked out at the assembled crowd with confidence and pride, a man at the absolute peak of his power. 5 years ago, David began, and Sarah felt her jaw clench. I was nobody. I had a dream and a failing startup, but no money and no prospects. I was drowning in debt, days away from losing everything, but I refused to give up. I worked around the clock, lived on nothing, and poured every ounce of my energy into building something meaningful. The crowd nodded appreciatively, hanging on every word of the familiar narrative. Today, David continued, we're taking David Mitchell Enterprises public with a valuation of $2.3 billion. This company represents pure determination, the kind of success that comes from refusing to accept failure. And I want to thank every investor in this room for believing in me, for seeing the potential in my vision. The room erupted in applause. Jessica beamed from the front row, her new wedding ring catching the light. The investors looked satisfied, already calculating their returns. The press scribbled notes about the self-made billionaire who had conquered the business world through sheer willpower. And Sarah stepped out from behind the column. She walked down the center aisle, her blue dress flowing around her pregnant form, and the room slowly fell silent as people noticed her. Whispers started immediately. Who was this woman? Why was she walking toward the stage? David's eyes locked on her, and Sarah saw confusion flash across his face, followed quickly by anger. Sarah, what are you doing? David hissed, but his microphone was still on, and his words carried through the room. Sarah climbed the steps to the stage, and when David moved to block her path, Richard Chen stood up from his seat. Let her speak, Richard said, his voice carrying authority that made David freeze. Sarah walked to the podium, and David had no choice but to step aside or cause a scene. She looked out at the assembled crowd, at the investors who had believed David's lies, at the press who had written glowing articles about his self-made success, at Jessica who was staring at her with undisguised hatred. My name is Sarah Mitchell, she said, and her voice didn't shake. And I'm here to tell you the truth about how this company was really built. David moved toward her, but Richard and 2 other investors stood up, creating a barrier between them. Let her finish, Richard said firmly. Sarah opened the briefcase and pulled out the first document. 5 years ago, I won $50 million in the lottery. My husband, David, was crying on our apartment floor because his company was failing and he owed money to dangerous people. I loved him, so I made a choice. I gave him everything. She projected the bank transfer receipt on the screen behind her. $50 million, from Sarah Williams to David Mitchell Enterprises. Dated 5 years and 3 months ago. The exact moment David's company miraculously came back from the dead. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. David's face went white. Jessica's mouth fell open. David told you he built this empire from nothing, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He told you about his hard work, his determination, and his genius business strategy. But what he didn't tell you is that every single dollar he started with came from my lottery winnings. The initial capital, the investment that saved his company and launched his success, was mine. She projected the next document. The equity agreement, signed by David 5 years ago. The terms were clear, laid out in her father's careful legal language. In the event of divorce proceedings or proven infidelity, the capital investor retained 90% ownership of all assets purchased with the initial investment. David filed for divorce 3 months ago, Sarah said, and her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. He moved his mistress into our home. He forced me while pregnant with his child to work as a gatekeeper, opening and closing the gate while he told the world he was a self-made billionaire. He erased me from his story, rewrote history to make himself the hero, and thought I would just disappear. Sarah looked directly at David, and her eyes blazed with the fire of months of humiliation and betrayal. But I didn't disappear, David, and neither did the documents you signed. According to the equity agreement, you couldn't be bothered to read because you were so desperate for my money. I own 90% of this company. 90% of everything you've built with my $50 million. The room exploded. Investors were on their feet, shouting questions. Reporters surged forward with cameras flashing. Jessica turned to David with horror dawning on her face, finally understanding that the money she thought was his had never belonged to him at all. David found his voice, and it came out strangled with desperation. This is insane. Sarah, you're clearly having some kind of breakdown. Security, remove her from the stage. But Richard Chen stepped forward, and his voice cut through the chaos like a knife. I've reviewed these documents, and they're legally binding. The bank transfer is verified. The equity agreement has both signatures and a witness. David, if what Sarah is saying is true, then you've been committing fraud by claiming sole ownership of a company you don't actually control. Another investor stood up, a woman named Catherine Moore who was known for her ruthless business sense. I want an emergency board meeting. Right now. If this company's ownership structure is not what we were told, then this IPO is built on false pretenses. David's face was red with rage and humiliation. Sarah did this out of spite. She's angry about the divorce and she's trying to destroy me. No, David, Sarah said quietly, and somehow her soft voice carried through the chaos. You destroyed yourself. I gave you everything out of love and you repaid me with cruelty. You made me invisible, forced me to serve in my own home, and tried to erase the fact that every success you've achieved was built on my sacrifice. I'm not destroying you. I'm simply telling the truth you tried so hard to bury. Jessica stood up and her face was a mask of betrayal and rage. Wait, she said, her voice shrill. So the money is hers. Everything, the house, the cars, the company, all of it came from her. David reached for Jessica's hand, but she jerked away from him like he was poison. You told me you were self-made. You told me you built this empire from nothing. You let me believe you were a genius when all along you were just spending your wife's money. Jessica, please, David said, and for the first time Sarah heard real fear in his voice. Let me explain. But Jessica was already taking off the wedding ring he had given her just hours ago. She dropped it on the floor between them, and the sound of it hitting the marble was like a gunshot in the silent room. Explain to someone who cares, Jessica said coldly. I didn't sign up to be with a fraud. She turned and walked out of the hall, her wedding dress trailing behind her, and half the guests followed, unwilling to be associated with the scandal that was unfolding. The press stayed, cameras rolling, capturing every moment of David's fall from grace. Catherine Moore stood at the front of the room, and her expression was ice. I'm calling for an immediate vote. All those in favor of removing David Mitchell as CEO pending investigation of these fraud allegations. Richard Chen's hand went up immediately. Then another investor, and another, until everyone except 2 people who had personal friendships with David had voted for his removal. Motion passes, Catherine said. David, you're relieved of your duties effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises while we sort out the legal ownership of this company. And Sarah, she turned to look at the pregnant woman still standing at the podium, we need to have a very serious conversation about what happens next. David stood there, frozen, watching his entire world collapse around him. Just hours ago, he had been a billionaire getting married to a beautiful woman in front of 300 people. Now he was being voted out of his own company, abandoned by his new wife, and exposed as a fraud in front of everyone who mattered in his world. Sarah walked down from the stage, and as she passed David, he grabbed her arm. "Sarah, please, we can fix this. I'll make it right. I'll do whatever you want." Sarah looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. The face she had loved. The face that had cried in her arms 5 years ago. The face that had looked at her with such coldness when he forced her to become a gatekeeper. "You had months to make it right," Sarah said quietly, pulling her arm free. "You chose cruelty instead. Now live with the consequences." She walked away and David called after her, his voice breaking. "Sarah, don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But Sarah didn't turn around. She walked out of the grand hall with her mother at her side, and they left David standing alone in the ruins of everything he had stolen. Outside, the sun was setting over Lagos, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah stood on the front steps of the mansion she had paid for with her lottery winnings, and she felt the baby move inside her. Strong, alive, a reminder that some things survived even the worst betrayals. "What happens now?" Margaret asked softly. Sarah looked at her mother, then back at the mansion. "Now we rebuild. The company is mine, the house is mine. Everything David claimed as his is actually mine. The lawyers will sort out the details, but for the first time in months, Mama, I feel like I can breathe again." Margaret hugged her daughter tightly, and they stood there on the steps as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Inside the mansion, Sarah could hear shouting, lawyers arguing, investors demanding answers. David's world was burning, and from the ashes, Sarah would build something new. But as they turned to walk toward Margaret's car, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the gate. The windows were tinted, and Sarah couldn't see who was inside. The driver's window rolled down, and a man in an expensive suit looked out at her. "Sarah Mitchell?" the man asked. "Yes," Sarah replied cautiously. "My name is Vincent Okafor. I represent David's creditors, the people he owed money to 5 years ago before you gave him that $50 million. The man's smile was cold and calculated. David never actually paid off those debts, you see. He just postponed them, assuming his new wealth would make them disappear. But debt doesn't disappear, Mrs. Mitchell, it grows. And now that David has been removed as CEO and his assets are frozen, those creditors are very interested in speaking with the woman who actually owns everything." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that David's old debts have become your problem now, Mrs. Mitchell. And these particular creditors don't accept payment plans. They expect full satisfaction with interest within 30 days. That's approximately $80 million. He handed her a business card through the window. "We'll be in touch very soon. Congratulations on your victory today. I do hope you can enjoy it while it lasts." The Mercedes drove away, leaving Sarah standing frozen on the steps. She had defeated David, exposed his lies, and reclaimed everything he had stolen. But in doing so, she had inherited his demons, debts so dangerous that even $50 million might not be enough to make them disappear. Margaret grabbed Sarah's arm, her face pale with fear. "Sarah, what have we done?" Sarah looked down at the business card in her trembling hand, and then back at the mansion that was finally hers again. She had won the battle against David, but the war was far from over. And somewhere in Lagos, in the darkness beyond the gate she used to guard, dangerous people were watching and waiting, ready to collect on debts 5 years old. Sarah had reclaimed her empire. Now she had to figure out how to survive it.